We are tremendously honored to have with us tonight Michael Glennon to discuss, amongst other things, torturing the rule of law, why the President, Congress, and courts do little to change U.S. national security policy. Professor Glennon has had an incredibly distinguished career. Not least, he was legal counsel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee during the chairmanship of Frank Church in the late 1970s. Subsequently, he's had a number of positions, including as a Fulbright Distinguished Professor of International and Constitutional Law, fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Thomas Hawkins Johnson Visiting Scholar at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Director of Studies at the Hague Academy of International Law, and invited professor at the University of Paris from 2006 to 2012, and now, of course, he is at the Fletcher School. Professor Glennon has written very recently a book called National Security and Double Government, which is also outside in the hall there. And so what we'll have him do is speak for roughly 15 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A session for approximately 40. So without further ado, Professor Glennon, thank you so much for joining us.
Jacob, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm going to make three very quick points about the torture report that was just, maybe we could close that door, if you don't mind. Released 2 days ago by the Senate Intelligence Committee. I'm going to suggest to you first that the significance of the report lies more in what it doesn't say than in what it says. Second, that those deficiencies can be traced largely to deficiencies in the process of congressional oversight of the intelligence community. And third, that the explanation for those deficiencies in intelligence oversight lies largely, not entirely, but largely with the structure of double government that has emerged in the United States with respect to national security policy. So first, the Senate torture report. We tortured some people, some folks, President Obama said. 5 years ago, in response to that realization, the Senate Intelligence Committee undertook a little study of CIA detention and interrogation practices. And after spending $40 million on that project, came up with a report that is still classified. It's over 6,000 pages long, with the executive summary in excess of 500 pages, excerpts of which have been printed in the news media over the last few days. The principal finding of the report is that torture is ineffectual, and from my perspective, the significance of the report, such as it is, lies in the fact that it belies the claim that the political institutions of the United States government approved of torture. Consent means informed consent, and informed consent cannot be given when it is given in response to material misrepresentations. And if the Senate Intelligence Committee's report is true, very serious misrepresentations were made by the CIA with respect to these torture programs, not only to the Senate Intelligence Committee, but also to the Justice Department and the White House itself, all of which undercuts the claim that the political branches approved. The real significance of the report, however, to me, lies in what it does not address, namely issues of legal and institutional responsibility. Throughout the report is raised the question, is this legal? It's barely possible to read a single page in that report to see any of the activities that are described without asking yourself, what's the law with respect to this particular conduct? And the report does not answer that. It makes no attempt to identify an applicable legal framework or to apply it, so that we're left with questions concerning the applicability of the Torture Convention, customary international law, U.S. statutory law, U.S. constitutional law, and all the rest. These are important issues, and there are many of them. One, for example, is raised with respect to the infamous torture memos. Were the CIA operators who carried out this program entitled to rely upon John Yu's memos, which is effectively said on behalf of the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel that these activities were permissible? Was it permissible for the operators to rely upon a memo that may have been frivolous? Was it frivolous? If they did rely upon the Justice Department's guidance, did they stay within the parameters that were set forth in those Yu memos? Bottom line, if these activities were in fact unlawful, why has no one been prosecuted? And the ultimate question, of course, is an institutional question of responsibility. You know, the United States hanged Japanese war prisoners in the Philippines in World War II for engaging in waterboarding. We found guilty a Japanese general who should have known, but didn't actually know, that those activities were going on under his command, Yamashita. Is the United States going to apply those same principles of command responsibility to itself? None of these questions are addressed in the report, and one possible reason is that they would lead back to the author of the report. Where was the Senate Intelligence Committee while all these activities were going on? It is the principal oversight committee of the Central Intelligence Agency. Where was the Senate Intelligence Committee while all this was happening? You know, it's been claimed that nothing of significance happens in the world of intelligence without the Intelligence Oversight Committees knowing about it. That is not correct. The Senate Intelligence Committee did not know that the CIA videotaped the torture sessions, some of the torture sessions that are described in this report. When the CIA destroyed the videotapes, the Senate Intelligence Committee did not know about that. The Senate Intelligence Committee did not know about the establishment of the black site prisons where these activities occurred. The don't knows, didn't knows apply beyond the world of torture. The Senate Intelligence Committee didn't know how the metadata collected by NSA with respect to telephone calls in the United States was being used. The committee did not know that Angela Merkel's cell phone was being surveilled by NSA. The committee did know, going back in time, that the CIA had mined the harbors of Managua, but it didn't know that it knew that because it didn't notice that the CIA had reported it. When Barry Goldwater, the then chairman of the committee, read about it in the New York Times, he went to the Senate floor outraged and accused the Reagan administration of an act of war, only to be told by his staff that actually we were told about that and you didn't say anything. Well, Barry Goldwater is long gone from the scene, but his spirit lives on in the leadership of that committee. You know, aside from making no findings with respect to law and no recommendations with respect to policy, sticking merely to the facts, 9,400 documents were requested by the Senate Intelligence Committee in connection with this report. The CIA said no, and the Senate Intelligence Committee dropped the request. 9,400 documents not transmitted. The committee issued no subpoenas. The committee called no witnesses. The committee took no depositions. The committee sent no staff members to these black site prisons to interview anybody. No victims were interviewed. No operators of the CIA were interviewed. So that's the state of intelligence oversight in the United States. The 9/11 Commission used one word to describe it: dysfunctional. It was dysfunctional then, and it is dysfunctional today. The third question is, how could this have happened? How could this have happened? Walter Bagehot, in 1867, in his little book, The English Constitution, described the emergence of a system of double government in Britain. And with respect to national security policy, that is what has happened in the United States today. A set of bifurcated institutions have emerged. The United States has developed a set of dignified institutions: Congress, the courts, and the presidency, that the public believes manage national security policy. But in fact, national security policy is formulated and executed by a set of efficient institutions, the managers of the military, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies of the United States, who operate largely removed from limitations imposed by the Constitution and electoral restrictions. There are exceptions to this, of course, as Bagehot's theory suggests. Those exceptions are necessary to generate legitimacy. The people have to believe that the dignified institutions are actually running the show. Otherwise, the entire system would collapse because public deference would be eviscerated. But as a general rule, the formulation and execution of national security policy in the United States is dominated by the efficient institutions that I've just described, and the dignified institutions, Congress, the presidency, and the courts, all largely defer to it. Bagehot's theory, therefore, explains and it predicts, as any good theory would. It explains why national security policy in the United States has remained so amazingly constant from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. Drone strikes, non-prosecution of torturers, invocation of the state secrets privilege, prosecution of whistleblowers. The first 3 pages of the book are filled with example after example of national security policies that have remained unchanged from the Obama administration to the Bush administration, even though, of course, Barack Obama, as a senator and candidate for president, campaigned eloquently and forcefully against those same policies. The theory predicts that the response of the dignified institutions to the Snowden disclosures will be to to make cosmetic changes in the legal structure, if that, and thus far, even cosmetic changes have not been made in response to any of the disclosures by Mr. Snowden. The theory finally predicts that no significant change will be made in response to the Senate torture report. And most alarmingly, it predicts that barring foundational changes, the dignified institutions of the United States government will continue on the same trajectory that they have been on, and gradually and slowly and quietly be transformed into constitutional and institutional museum pieces like the British House of Lords and monarchy. So that is the cheery holiday message from the United States. I'd be glad to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask you the first question, if you don't mind. And it seems to me that what you've described is a sort of one of two things. It's either a sort of increasing trajectory towards the efficient institutions, as you call them, taking real control of national policy, or it's part of a cycle, a sort of sine wave, if you will, of increasing power of these institutions versus increasing power of the formal sort of legal institutions. Do you have a sense of whether this is part of a sort of centuries-long trend towards one particular direction or the other, or if this will peak and if we'll go back in the other direction? And if so, what do you think could lead to a sort of resumption of power amongst the elected institutions?
It's not a centuries-long trend, I think, Jacob. It is a phenomenon that began really in the late 1940s and early 1950s in the Truman administration, which is responsible, I suspect, more than any other for the establishment of the national security apparatus that exists today. It was in the Truman administration in 1947, the National Security Act of 1947 was enacted, in which the CIA was established, the command of the military was centralized, the National Security Council was established, and in 1952, that the National Security Administration was established, and these institutions have steadily increased in power since then, and you can really draw almost a straight line upwards since then. There have been blips. In the 1970s, for example, the Church Committee, which you mentioned, I worked for Frank Church, did, in response to a number of revelations of wrongdoing concerning the CIA, NSA, FBI, Army engaged in domestic surveillance and various other programs, did result in a number of reforms, such as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the establishment of the Permanent Intelligence Committee, traces from the days of the Church Committee. So it would be easy to think that these events are cyclical. I think that would be a mistake, and I think that there was kind of a perfect storm politically that occurred in the 1970s as a result of the confluence of three different major political events: Vietnam, Watergate, and the revelations that the Church Committee responded to. And these together made it possible for this range of reforms, which was in fact much more limited than most people believe, to be enacted. So I do not, as I said in my remarks, approach this with much optimism. And I think that unless, as I say, some foundational change is made, that the United States is likely to continue on this course.
Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor to questions now. I would say two things briefly. First of all, for the benefit of those who will be watching on video, I'm going to summarize the questions as we have the microphone up here and the rest of you don't. So if you could identify yourself briefly, and because I'm sure there'll be a number of questions about this, I'm sure everyone has something they'd like to ask. If you could please keep your questions relatively brief. And with that, Rory.
Thanks, I'm Walter Bagehot, I'm manager of the US program here. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was really fascinating. Very short in the beginning, so apologies if this was covered. But in terms of the thesis of your book and your overall argument, you're suggesting kind of a real continuation of what's going on currently. Do you think there's a possibility that it could lead to, as perhaps happened in the 70s with the Church Committee, such a bleak outcome that there is kind of a reverberation in public opinion against what is going on? Or do you think it's going to lead to a long-term change in the way US foreign policy is formulated? Or do you just really just see it as continuation at the moment?
So a question about sort of whether the current state of affairs will continue or whether there will reach a breaking point.
I do not believe that we will reach a breaking point. I think that this current dissatisfaction of the American public in response to the torture report will continue. It'll be debated for the next several weeks, several months, as the Snowden disclosures were, and gradually it will be forgotten as the Snowden disclosures have been. And I see no significant long-term reforms coming out of it, I'm sad to say.
There's a question right here.
Mary Deshevsky, I'm a former Washington correspondent and write a column for the Independent newspaper. I've got two questions. One of them, 9/11. Did 9/11, as it were, hasten this tendency? And the other question is more speculative, but in at least one of the paper's coverages in the UK this morning, there was reference to the US having something akin to a deep state on the model of what we associate with Turkey or Egypt or something like that. And what you have said doesn't actually exclude that sort of thing.
So two questions, one about whether 9/11 hastened this and whether the United States has a deep state.
9/11 certainly did hasten it. The phenomenon of double government is fed by public fear, which is exacerbated by perceived foreign threats, a sense of emergency, and occasional panic of the sort that sets in following videos of beheadings, which seems to have convinced many Americans that they should be careful going down to the shopping center Saturday morning because Al-Qaeda or the Khorasan group may have set up a beheading operation next to the Sears outlet. So yes, of course, the ultimate amplifier of these shocks, however, was, I think, very astutely identified in Bagehot, and it is something, in fact, that was not original with Bagehot, something that the framers of the United States Constitution talked about at great length. They refer to it as civic virtue. Bagehot talks about the deleterious effects of political ignorance. This has been a topic of some interest to political scientists in the United States of late. In fact, Justice David Souter, who's just recently retired from the United States Supreme Court, referred to the pervasive civic ignorance of the American people. I'm not going to destroy your evening by regaling you with statistics, but 25% of the American electorate does not know that the United States declared its independence from Britain. 40% of the electorate doesn't know who the United States fought during World War II. 80% of the electorate doesn't know who was president during World War I. 83% of young people aged 18 to 24 were unable to locate Afghanistan on a map during the height of the war in Afghanistan, and similar percentages couldn't find Iraq on a map in the middle of that war. Thomas Jefferson said, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be." That's the central driver of double government in the United States today. It is amplified and exacerbated by the shocks that came from 9/11, but the fundamental problem is far more basic. So, does this mean that the United States has moved to a deep state, an invisible government, a shadow government? I myself don't like those terms. And I don't like those terms because they imply a conspiracy. The point of my book is that this structure has been adopted by the United States unwittingly, and we've in effect drifted into this system of double government in response to a wide variety of incentives that are embedded in the American legal and political system. So I don't like the suggestion that this has all been a function of some grand, nefarious, clandestine scheme, or that there are even nefarious motives involved. My book is not a morality play. There are not villains and heroes. I think it's important for this country, for the United States, as polarized as it is, to get beyond this moralism and to start thinking about our problems in terms of systemic incentives and analyzing why actors within the government do what they do in response to the structure of the government in which they find themselves. So I don't find it useful to compare the United States to Egypt or Turkey when it comes to the deep state. Thank you.
There's a question in the corner there.
Yeah, Stephen Carter, I'm the head of the Afghanistan program at Global Witness, which is an organization that works on government instruction, human rights and conflict. And I have one question and one very brief observation. And the question is, what is the remedy? I mean, what are the reforms that could potentially solve this problem? From what you said, it sounds as if the whole-scale reform of the education system would need to be part of the solution, but is there anything more immediate than that, and perhaps more structural? And the observation is that you say that this is something which finds, I think, a lot of parallels if you look at policy in Afghanistan, and that there is a recurring pattern of support for measures and tactics that are counterproductive and that rely on, for example, cooperation with extremely abusive local commanders, that rely on cooperation with people who are sources of corruption, and a very much CIA-driven policy and very short-termist. And you can make a very direct link between that and the increase in insecurity. And it's not just, as with the torture report, that you can say that there is substantial doubt that there's any benefit from the torture program, but you can actually directly point to it being a primary cause of undermining stability and US objectives in Afghanistan. And yet, it has never been substantially challenged and has never changed, despite having many different leaders in place. That may be possibly starting to change now, but we shall have to see. So I think it's obviously a problem which is, I think, entrenched more broadly than just in the CIA and not just in America.
So a question about what the remedy is and an observation about the links between Afghanistan and policy in Washington.
The fact that there are a number of policies that seem to fall in that category was the impetus for writing this book. It seemed to me that someone had to try to explain why this happened over and over and over. And Bagehot's theory in this respect dovetails with modern organizational behavior theory in describing why these sorts of bureaucracies that are highly secretive with the great esprit de corps, prone to groupthink, and committed to the status quo, keep doing the same thing even though there's no payoff.
And very short term in the outlook is the thing. It's always a triumph of the short term. And we're very narrow.
Because the benefits can be enjoyed in the short term and the costs can be pushed off to the future. And that happens over and over again. And so I think that you've given a fine example of what I'm talking about. With respect to the remedy, I'm afraid my answer to your question is yes. The answer is not to focus on remedies that can be implemented by the government, because the government is the problem. The focus needs to be the people. The energy has to come from outside the government, or to put it differently, you can't look to hollowed out institutions to come up with the energy to fix themselves, because the absence of energy within those institutions to carry out their constitutionally assigned functions is the very problem. And
no changes in constitutional changes or changes in oversight mechanisms, none of that can help.
Those are going to be short-term fixes. The Church Committee tried that. I worked for Frank Church. There was a lot of attention paid to the whole issue of intelligence oversight. And, you know, what is it now, 30 years since the Church Committee's reforms, we are right back to where we started, if not in a worse position, because people believe today that the system is working, and it's not. In fact, I see repeatedly the suggestion that we should be so thankful that the framers set up a self-correcting system. You see this over and over in the American press, the self-congratulation at having a self-correcting system. That's only half of the framers' design. The equilibrium that was expected to come from ambition set against ambition would obtain only if the prior predicate were met, and that is the predicate of civic virtue. If you have an informed and engaged citizenry who elect individuals to public office who are committed to the public good. And that predicate is missing today, and that's, more than anything else, the reason that that equilibrium has collapsed.
Gentleman in the back here.
I'm George Lambrakis, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, and I'm appreciative that you didn't include the State Department in your list of the organizations. I'm not sure if that's not because you think it's not efficient, but we'll leave that aside. I wanted this as a follow-up to your explanation that why the American people is ignorant of a lot of this stuff. They don't even know where Iraq is, they don't know where Afghanistan is. But should we include in that the fact that most American presidents are elected to office with very little, if any, background in international affairs? Should we add the fact that so many members of Congress don't have a passport? Some of those that do spend their time coming to visit, eating, drinking well, getting photographs of the head of government, going home again. In other words, I'm assuming on what you say that you're not thinking of who are the good guys and the bad guys. But is it so unlikely that people who spend their life on foreign affairs, whether they be in intelligence or in the Defense Department, not necessarily state where I work, would they therefore have to constantly check back with people who didn't know very much and should not be doing things getting ahead of their masters when their masters are way behind them?
Yes.
So I think that aspect of what you're saying is worth looking into, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So a question about the sort of lack of internationalism amongst American policymakers.
Well, your two questions are very closely related, as you suggest. Let me begin with the first. Why this continuing widespread political ignorance on the part of the public? The short answer is because it's rational to be ignorant. And that makes the problem virtually intractable. Let me elaborate. When I suggest that the American people are ignorant, I don't mean that they're not smart. Raw IQ scores have actually gone up significantly over the last several decades. As I say in the book, anyone capable of following a sport as complex as American football and understanding the rules, being capable of parsing the costs and benefits of the nickel defense is not stupid. It's not a question of a lack of raw intelligence. The problem is that there is, to return to the basic point, a disincentive in the structure to spend time learning about and getting smart about issues that you can't affect. So students, for example, tend to think pretty overwhelmingly in the United States, students that some of us associate with at Harvard and MIT and Tufts, that Edward Snowden is a kind of a hero. They also think he's been mistreated. What do they do about that? Nothing, because they really don't see anything that they can do, and most Americans aren't even able to learn as much as these students have about the problems that Snowden has raised. So there's the nub of the problem, therefore, is that the United States is caught in this negative feedback loop in which the public becomes more and more disengaged and uninformed, and there is, therefore, all the more reason on the part of the efficient institutions, the national security managers, to exclude them from the process of national security policy making, because they really don't know what they're talking about. And in many cases that's true, as I suggested a while ago. Now, why do they elect the people that they do? Because they don't know any better, because political ignorance is as widespread as it is. That's why so many members of Congress don't have passports, and why so many members of the American public don't have passports, I guess. You know, Adlai Stevenson, I think, put it well. He said, in a democracy, people get exactly the quality of government that they deserve. And these are the kinds of office holders that you would expect to be elected from people of the sort who have the level of civic engagement and information that I've just described.
Wouldn't the follow-up to what you just said be, however, yes, the CIA did very many bad things because they didn't have much experience. They certainly didn't have experience in torture. Who is going to run American foreign policy with the United States being as important as it has been since the 1940s and 50s? If it's not the people who know about it and spend their lives doing it, that's really the bottom. You explain how we got here, but you've got to carry it a step further, don't you? If you're talking about the professionals who are constantly running things, that's not all bad, even though we're talking about the torture report, which is bad. So I hope we don't leave this meeting thinking that somehow, you know, the people, the professionals are all sort of doing it all.
I hope we don't. And the book underscores precisely what you just said. Not only is it not all bad, but the Trumanite network, as I refer to the efficient institutions in the book, clearly provides very important benefits to the United States. It's got loads of institutional memory, experience, training. It can move quickly. It's not prone to idiosyncrasies in policy making and political gyrations. There are all kinds of benefits that it provides, which is one of the reasons, aside from the sheer expertise that you're familiar with. So it's entirely understandable that there's a systemic incentive for judges and senators and members of the National Security Council staff in the White House to defer to it. I mean, it would be irrational not to do that.
There's a question right here.
Morning, Dr. Jones. I'm a member of the part of the British Constitution which you seem to think, Professor, is fossilized. I would say that we do more, I might put it this way, actually, to keep, along with the courts, to keep the executive in check when it comes to human rights and civil liberties than other parts of the system, the commons. My question is twofold. One, how representative, how wide a stream of opinion in the States do you think former Vice President Cheney represents? He was pretty forthright in his comments as reported this morning. And secondly, you said on the one hand that the people seem to think that the system works, and on the other that they have to be the solution to the problem because the institutions don't seem to be able to reform themselves. Could you enlarge on how they're going to be able to do this?
So two questions. Sorry.
Yeah.
Two questions. One on Dick Cheney and how large a swath of the American population he represents, and the second on how reform could actually happen.
Well, particularly by people who, Professor seems to think actually believe the system's working, but on the other hand, you did say, it's going to be the people who have to do this, because the institutions, I think you were saying, are not capable of it.
I don't think any public opinion polls have been out yet. The report was just released 2 days ago. There have been regular public opinion polls over the last 10 years since 9/11, taking the temperature of the American people on torture. And you're referring to, I gather, to Dick Cheney's suggestion that they should not be prosecuted, they should be celebrated. They should be decorated, the torturers.
It's about containing a lot of crap.
Support for torture has increased over the last 10 years in the United States, and a majority of the American people, according to the most recent polls, now believe that it is often or sometimes justified. That number was below 50% and significantly below 50% in the several years following 9/11. Today, the last figure that I saw was a couple years old. It was 53% in favor. Now, separate question is why that would have occurred, and I'll pass on that for a moment. How can the institutions reform themselves? As I suggested, I think it's not sensible to think that the institutions can reform themselves. And the gentleman in the corner essentially asked the same question. What is then the solution? And to refer to my last sentence, I suggested that absent a foundational change, the likelihood is that the dignified institutions in the United States are going to continue on the same trajectory that they now are on. The foundational change...
You also said that the people think the system's working. And you said that the people have to be the source of this reform. That's the question I'm asking you, is how is that going to come about if you also assert that the people think the system's working?
I see. I didn't fully understand your question. Actually, as I describe in the book, and if I put it that bluntly, I misspoke. What I describe in the last chapter of the book is this, that the United States is now in a precarious position, if Bagehot's theory is correct, because significant portions of the American population now are not deluded into believing that the dignified institutions actually manage American national security policy. They see through the myth system. And the CIA torture report of the Senate Intelligence Committee, of course, will accelerate that trend. The other half of the equation, however, is that while they're now savvy enough to see through that myth system, they are not knowledgeable enough to participate as informed and engaged citizens in the policy-making process as the framers foresaw and intended. So Bagehot suggests that, if I read him correctly, when you are in this nether region that I've just described, there is a danger that the whole system will topple because it at once lacks the legitimacy necessary to sustain double government, but at the same time, you can't return to a unified single set of institutions because the people don't have the intellectual wherewithal to make it work. So I'm afraid I don't have any simple solution to getting out of that dilemma, but I think his earlier question points us in the way. I think the foundational change that I've referred to has to be undertaken by civil society and think tanks and churches and unions, and it is not going to be successful if we look to the government, in my view, to create the government's image of what it believes is a good citizen. You can't centralize power in the government for the purpose of accelerating a decentralization of power, which is what we would be asking the government to do if we look to the government for a solution to this problem.
Is there a question over here?
My name is Walter Bagehot. I'm a former research assistant to Professor Glennon, and I'm currently completing a PhD at the University of Cambridge in International Law. My question was about whether you think that the whole process has been inevitable. I mean, you described that the framers already raised this issue, so before Bagehot it was sort of a known issue. After Bagehot, Max Weber has described it in detail, as you point out in the end of your book. There's been loads of people who've been describing this problem, and still sort of the US seem to have walked into it with open eyes, and so have perhaps every other Western continent at least. So was this an inevitable process, or was that something that the US could have done to avoid it?
So, question of inevitability, really.
You always ask the hard questions, Bart. I don't know. You're asking me, in effect, whether I'm a determinist. I think we've probably talked about that question over many beers, and you're now trying to get me to recollect the answer that I gave you in a less clear state than I may be now. I think when you look back over American history, and I suspect that someday historians will look back over the last couple decades, 3 decades, and think, if I'm correct in my analysis, where did this great democracy go wrong? Where was the turning point? What could we have done differently? Was it the assassination of Bobby Kennedy? Was it the collapse of the Church Committee's reports? Was it the assassination of the CIA station chief in Athens that led to the funeral of the station chief when his coffin was brought back to Washington, and that was televised live on national television. And the assassination was attributed to the disclosures of the church committee. A lot of people think that that was the turning point. I think you could, as a historian, 50 years from now, probably profitably look back on this period and come up with a dozen different incidents like that and ask, could it have been different? The question to me, however, is not whether it could have been different. The question to me is whether we've now passed the point of no return, whether it's reversible. I'll recall to you Senator Frank Church's words in that regard. After the NSA's abuses were disclosed by the church committee, something called Operation Shamrock, in which the NSA was in the late 1960s and early 70s surveilling within the United States anti-war activists and civil rights activists and compiling a watch list of these people based upon intercepts of their telephone calls. Church said that if the National Security Administration ever turned its awesome capabilities inward on the American people, this nation would cross an abyss from which there is no return, because there will be no place to hide. I might add, it came out a few months ago that the very moment that Senator Church spoke those words, he was being spied upon by NSA. His international telephone calls were being intercepted by NSA. I don't believe he knew that. He certainly didn't tell me if he did.
I think we have just time for 2 more questions, and 2 more people have been waiting patiently, so.
Professor, thank you. I'm Andrew Bennell, a Fletcher alum and currently a student at Cambridge in the history faculty. I'm hearing your thesis of the book and the point you're making. I keep thinking if there's a way to historicize this and say, is not this possibly one of the great American questions that goes back to our founding, the Hamiltonian Jeffersonian idea of, are we going to the strong federal state? Are we, breaking it out to the people to let them rule? And as you look at the history of the United States and the atrocities and the things that have been committed over 2 centuries, Civil War, all that we've endured, I wonder. Often people say, well, there's an inherent goodness in the majority of the American population that sort of keeps us moving along the right direction, inevitably. Are you saying that the American people, if you accept that point, are you saying that perhaps today the American people have maybe lost their inherent decency? Or has something happened that has deceived the majority of the populace? Because you go back a couple of hundred years, and I don't know that people were very much more educated then, when you go back to the revolutionary period, or even through the 19th century, than they are today. So have we lost our goodness as a nation? That's a good question.
Have we lost our goodness as a nation?
You're reminding me of
Speaking of losing our goodness.
Might have some wisdom to impart to us from outside. Your question reminds me of President Dwight Eisenhower's famous observation to the effect that America is great because America is good, and if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. That would be a good epigram with which to have begun the Senate torture report. I'm not so sure I've ever believed that the American people are inherently better or worse than any other people. I think we've been extremely fortunate in many ways. I think we've had a remarkable run, and the United States has done a lot of good for the world. And I've been very proud of having the opportunity to work for the United States government in the past. I'm not so sure I'd be proud to work for the United States government today. But I don't think it's because people are more or less good than they've ever been. I do think, however, in answer to my earlier question concerning ultimate responsibility for what is described in the report, that the answer is that responsibility lies with the American people. And the American people need to assume that responsibility. And they need to do something soon and decisive so that they do not take ownership of what they've been reading about. Most of them didn't realize that these things were being done in their name. Some probably suspected it. To most, that will be a surprise. And if they don't do something soon and decisive, I think that they've got to undergo a very serious and major revision of their self-image as a people.
Last question. Just about time for one more. In the corner.
Jacob, thank you very much. Dr. James Boys, I'm author of the forthcoming book, Clinton's Grand Strategy. Can I build upon the last two questions, particularly from Dame Pauline's point of view? Because I think there appears to be a slight contradiction in some of what you're saying, which is, on the one hand, you're saying we've got an American population that can see through the myths. On the other hand, you're saying that they're not educated or informed enough about specific issues about where these countries are. 50% of Americans don't vote, and yet you're saying that they are the key and the engine of American renewal, effectively, in this issue. And you talked about the idea that they should play the role, I'm going to try and quote you here, that the founding fathers devised in terms of the policy formulation process. But sure, that's a mistake, because when the founding fathers put together the American system of government, the American people only voted for the House of Representatives. They had no direct elections to the Senate, and they still don't participate directly in the election of the presidency. So I guess what I'm asking is, how involved have the American people ever really been in the devising and the driving forward of American policy? And is part of the problem here the fact that you have such a short-term American electoral cycle on a 2-year basis that rewards short-term thinking and actually, in many ways, detracts from the long-term strategic vision that any grand strategy is required for, in particular the United States?
Have the American people ever really been involved in strategy?
Well, first of all, as you point out, the franchise was, in fact, far more restricted in the past than it has been in recent years. That's one answer to your question, and or one aspect of the answer to the question. Second, the complexity of problems that the American people have been confronting in recent years probably has grown. So the level of understanding or civic ignorance, depending upon which half of the glass you look at, has taken on a different significance in light of the growing complexity of the problems. I'm not sure I have a more adequate answer for your question than that, if only to suggest that in the early days of the Republic, the foreign threats that the United States faced in a globalized world were not present. It's not to say that the threats were not present, but they were very, very different. They were primarily from Indian tribes. And so I'm not sure that the whole analogy and comparison with the days of the Founding Fathers is that useful. In any event, there's just no question, that the framers believed that an intelligent and informed electorate was essential for the operation and survival of the Republic. And Thomas Jefferson's views, which I quoted a moment ago, were repeated by numerous of his colleagues. No one seriously believed during that period that you could, through a kind of mechanical contrivance, succeed in building an infrastructure of government better than the people. And at the base of that infrastructure, they all believed had to be a foundation of knowledge and education. And that's what's deteriorated in recent years.
That, unfortunately, is all we have time for, but I believe I'm correct in saying that Professor Glennon will be sticking around for a little bit to sign some copies of his book. So if you'd like to go next door. But in the meantime, I hope you found this evening as enlightening, if not cheerful, as I have. And I hope you'll join me in expressing our thanks to Professor Glennon for joining us.